Well, for more on what's being called Modinomics, let's bring in Sumit Ganguly. He's the Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Indiana University in Bloomington. Welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Now, this election is likely to become one of the most expensive elections in the world. Is there any correlation between the amount being spent and the significance of these elections?
Well, yes, because the ruling party is absolutely keen on winning, and consequently it's pulled out all the stops to try and ensure that it comes back to power. And the opposition seems to be equally energized, and they seem just as determined to stop the ruling party in its tracks. And consequently, both sides are spending a fair amount of money on advertising in various media, whether on social media or in more traditional forms of media like newspapers, which actually circulate quite widely in India and have not seen a drop-off as in the advanced industrialized world.
And as we look at the contributions, how have these wealthy tycoons played a role in this election?
That's rather murky. One doesn't really know how much money has been poured in by particular business houses into the campaigns because a lot of this is not particularly transparent. And consequently, one can only speculate about the money that flows in from business houses into the coffers of particular political parties. There's a great deal of innuendo and a great deal of suggestion that such monies are pouring in, but it's not entirely evident under India's electoral laws.
So how are these issues surrounding this lack of transparency in terms of political donations as well as conflicts of interest, how are they being addressed and received by voters?
Well, the elite newspapers have certainly discussed this, columnists have talked about it, but for the most part, the average man or woman in the street, these are not their principal concerns. Their concerns are much more about their everyday lives. It has to do with questions of employment, questions of access to health care, questions of infrastructure in the country, about in the rural areas, about price supports for agricultural products. Those are the kinds of things that animate their lives. They are far less concerned about whether or not political parties are soliciting money from large business houses and conglomerates.
So with this being considered a referendum on Modi's policies, how has India's economy fared with the so-called Modinomics?
It's actually a mixed bag. Economic growth has been sustained fairly well by this government, so one has to give it its due share. On the other hand, economic inequality, which was worsening earlier, has worsened considerably under the present government. Furthermore, as your reporter from New Delhi pointed out quite correctly, there is a failure on the part of this government to generate adequate employment. Thirdly, this government has not been able to tackle the agrarian crisis where farmers really are not receiving an adequate price for their crops. At one point, an onion farmer got so exasperated that he sent the entire amount of money that he received for a truckload of onions, which was a pittance, to the Prime Minister to express his deep sense of dissatisfaction with the government's policies. It was a symbolic act,
right,
but it was symbolic of a deeper malaise in the country.
Now let's look at India's relation with other countries. We know that India is the second most populous country after China. And as member countries in the BRICS group, along with Brazil, Russia and South Africa, how has the trade picture developed under Modi's leadership?
Well, exports actually have fallen in the recent past, and consequently the government has come under considerable criticism. India's principal import, as your reporter again correctly pointed out, is petroleum, and much of it comes from the Gulf, some of it from much further away, but close to 80% of India's energy needs are imported, and this is going to be a major issue in the months and the years ahead for India, unless it can make a transition to more renewable forms of energy.
Sumit Ganguly there, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Indiana University, Bloomington. Thanks so much.